All right, we are live. Welcome to From the Swamp to the States. This is Americans for Tax Reform state policy focused podcast where we go around the 50 states to talk about the policies and politics that you need to know about. And today we have a very special guest. Welcome to the show, Mailee Smith with the Illinois Policy Institute. Welcome, Mailee.
Thank you for having me today.
Well, we're really glad you could join us. Of course, we wish it was under better circumstances. We're going to be talking about ballot measures. We're talking about ballot measures across the country all week, highlighting some of the big issues, good and bad, that voters will face on election day. And they're already digesting if they're doing early voting. So we have a lot of questions out there that are really significant measures. And despite all of that, I think this might be the most significant negative measure that any state has to consider, and there's a lot going on here. So Mailee is kind enough to join us and break this down. Illinois, not been a bastion of freedom of late, and we're a little concerned it could get worse. So this is Amendment 1 in Illinois, and it makes a number of big labor changes. Mailee, can you give us the background just even before this measure of why is there a spark in Illinois, which I don't think anybody would say is unfriendly to big unions, to further empower them? Where's this coming from?
That's a great question. And I think there are two places that this is coming from. One, we currently have a supermajority of Democrats in our state legislature and a Democratic governor. So I think unions saw this as a prime time, particularly government unions, to get something passed that cements their power in the state constitution and therefore can't be changed. They frequently point to the Rauner years. Governor Rauner was the governor for one term before Pritzker. He had an agenda where he wanted to pass right to work, things of that nature. Never even had a hearing in Illinois, so it wasn't close to ever coming to pass, but they point to that as a reason. Another reason that I think behind the scenes is that government unions in Illinois have been losing members. They've lost about 9% of their membership since 2017. That includes 10% of teacher members. And, unions talk about how their power is in their solidarity, and they're losing those members. That equates to about $38 million a year in dues and fees that they're not getting. So between having this prime political landscape to push something through and needing to recoup some power that they're losing through their bleeding membership, I think that is where this amendment comes from.
Well, and we have any idea what the causes of that? Is that part of just generally workers are leaving Illinois?
So 2018 was the Janus versus AFSCME decision, and that allowed government workers, government union members to leave their unions. And
Right.
We hear from hundreds of workers a year that are upset with their unions, don't feel that their unions are representing them. And so they are leaving their unions. And you're right, we're also seeing jobs, on the private sector side, we're seeing jobs leave the state. Major companies are leaving. Caterpillar, Boeing, Citadel. We definitely have a reputation of being a bad place to do business. Unfortunately, this amendment is only going to seal that reputation for us and is going to, induce more of a jobs exodus than we're seeing right now.
Certainly. And just want to remind folks as we discuss this issue, if you're watching, if you have any questions, you can plug those right into social media. Shoot your questions right at us, and we'll be happy to answer them as we go along here. This is certainly a dense measure, so there may be some questions or things that require more explanation. So we'd love the feedback. So let's get into the measure a little bit more. There's a number of provisions here, so help explain to the audience. But the lead item is that it creates a fundamental right to organize and bargain collectively in the state constitution.
That's right.
So, what does that mean? What will that change?
So first of all, this fundamental right is supposedly guaranteed to all employees in the state of Illinois. Employees is not defined. It could apply to government sector workers who are not generally unionized. It could, apply to more administrative, managerial, maybe even elected officials.
Okay.
And it also includes potentially the private sector. The problem is that the state can't do that. Well, one of many problems is that the state can't do that. The National Labor Relations Act already governs relationships between unions and employers and bargaining. And when the federal government occupies a space, a state can't come in and also try to regulate that space. So proponents of this amendment are billing this as a fundamental right for workers that's going to protect all workers. And it really only applies to government workers, which is about 7% of our adult population. So in terms of what it changes nothing for the private sector, even though they're saying that it will. For the public sector, it is granting government union leaders an ability to bargain and bargain for far more than they have ever been able to do in the past.
And what does that come down to? I remember as a New Yorker, the Buffalo Teachers Union used to have plastic surgery covered. I mean, is that the kind of thing we're talking about? Because they go farther than that?
It's farther than that. So the first line of the amendment is this grant of a fundamental right that applies to government unions. The second provision in the amendment expands bargaining for unions. So it guarantees their ability to bargain over wages and hours in terms and conditions of employment, which is very typical language. That's in many states. It's in our current state law. That's how the National Labor Relations Act frames it. But then it adds subjects. It adds economic welfare and safety at work. Economic welfare is undefined. It's untested. No state has it. The federal government doesn't have that. It could mean virtually anything. And we've seen government unions in Illinois already try to bargain for things that are outside typical negotiations. So, for example, Chicago Teachers Union, which is arguably one of the most militant unions in the nation, government unions, in their last round of negotiations, they were demanding housing allowances. They were demanding that the city take legislative positions on things like rent control. So there are any number of things that could be tied to so-called economic welfare that government unions could now be negotiating, demanding in their contracts. And an important third provision in this amendment is that it actually prohibits lawmakers from ever changing anything. So lawmakers could never restrict. We have a right to strike here, which is unusual for government workers. None of our neighboring states allow most or all workers to strike. Illinois does. So they have this expanded right to bargain that can never be changed legislatively, and lawmakers will not be able to limit the right to strike or restrict when they can go on strike. So it's granting government unions this power to demand virtually anything, go on strike to get those demands met. And obviously that's going to drive up the cost of government. It's going to drive up the cost of those contracts. That's going to be passed on to the taxpayers. And that's really what's at stake here. So while this is being framed as a workers' rights amendment, what it really is a hidden tax hike.
And so there are a number of things in there that could be very significant. And you hit on the economic welfare terminology. So you said no state has language like that.
No state does. And I should say that this is a very broad amendment. So I've covered three provisions: the fundamental right, the expansion of subjects, this prohibition on lawmakers to ever change anything. And then the last is a ban on right to work. And not a single state constitution has any one of those provisions, let alone all four of them. And in fact, states frequently cited by proponents of this amendment have things that make it very different. So for example, proponents cite Hawaii as having a similar amendment. Mm-hmm. Hawaii grants a right, not a fundamental right, but a right to collectively bargain to public employees. But then it adds, as provided by law. So it is actually giving deference to state lawmakers to legislate appropriate labor laws, whereas Amendment 1 is taking away that power, taking away that deference, and taking away the voice of the people in their representatives to create appropriate labor laws.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a significant piece. So we have the economic welfare language, which could potentially mean almost anything, and we're unclear on what that means because it's never been put into law before. So, is this something where a court has any idea what this means if somebody gets sued over this?
Not that we have found, and that is the danger, particularly for the private sector. While the rights that are created in this amendment cannot apply in the private sector,
Mhm.
that doesn't mean unions won't try to use it. So what we would expect is that this is going to create patchwork litigation throughout the state of Illinois until we have that one final decision that says, that final court decision that says, oh, well, the state of Illinois can't do this. All of this that they're trying to do in the private sector with economic welfare and increased subjects of bargaining doesn't apply for the private sector, only the public sector. That's a scary prospect for employers and businesses in Illinois because they don't want to be that test case. They don't want to be that case that results in that final decision. But unfortunately, it's going to create havoc in the state until we have that.
So that could honestly be even worse than I was thinking that could spread this to private sector industry.
Well, it probably wouldn't spread it to the private sector, but those individual employers that have to battle it until they get that final court decision
Okay.
are certainly going to be gone. They're going to have to go through the litigation that is costly
Right.
and time consuming and obviously a burden. The only part of this amendment that can apply to the private sector is that fourth provision that is a ban on right to work. And the reason it can apply is because there's a carve out in the National Labor Relations Act that allows states to determine that for themselves. But the rest of the amendment, the rights that are created, the expanded bargaining, that cannot apply in the private sector. But like I said, unfortunately, It's probably going to take a court opinion until we get that final decision.
Got a very, very helpful clarification. It does sound like terminology that may be used somewhere else in the future. Not accidental that we have this very vague new term that could create additional powers for unions
we would
to bring
expect
to the court.
Yeah, we would expect that. We expect this to be the blueprint for other blue states. Tim Drea, who is the president of the Illinois AFL-CIO, was on the radio a few weeks ago, and he stated that they are getting interest from other states. So the translation is there are other state union leaders that are reaching out to him because they are interested in doing this in their own states. And so states that have particularly powerful government unions should be on the lookout for what happens with this and what could happen in their state, because if they win here, they are going to try this in other places.
Yeah, and we can talk more about that as we go on after we get through going through the provisions a little bit further. But I think there's a huge risk here for a state like Illinois, the Californias and New Yorks of the country, which are sending people fleeing to the exits. One, that matters for the people who live in those states. Two, at some point, it's going to matter to people in other states, taxpayers in other states, and the federal government. And this stuff, if you don't live in Illinois, you can't ignore it because somebody may try it in your state, and or Illinois completely destroying its economic environment will have a consequence for your state as well. Well, let's go through some of the other things to make sure everyone's clear on the provisions, because they're all really significant. And you mentioned that this is written in a way to specifically prevent the legislature from overriding or interfering with any of these provisions, which is a huge step. And what are the potential implications of that?
Yeah, that is a particularly drastic provision in this amendment. And again, not something we see in any other state. So in the immediate future, something that we can expect, or that can't happen, I guess, is lawmakers couldn't decide, oh, wow, economic welfare, we didn't mean for that to be so incredibly broad. We only mean for that to mean XYZ. They could never define or limit what economic welfare is. They could not limit or restrict the strike power that government unions have in Illinois. They couldn't change any labor laws because unions would be able to claim that that runs afoul of the Constitution and the bargaining rights and the unionization rights in Illinois. But it's actually even more drastic than that. This amendment elevates these agreements, these collective bargaining agreements, to the level of the Constitution. They carry the weight of the Constitution. They're constitutionally guaranteed. They can negotiate virtually anything. And we already have a law in Illinois that allows some government unions to override state law through their collective bargaining agreements. And that sounds crazy, but it's right there in our labor laws that if there's a conflict between some collective bargaining agreements and state or local law, the collective bargaining agreement language wins out. This would allow that to apply to all government union contracts. So we've actually identified over 350 state laws that government unions could override, that they could nullify just by writing a contrary provision into their collective bargaining agreements. And lawmakers won't be able to do anything about it because their hands will be tied by this amendment. These provisions include things like background checks on teachers for licensure or background checks on our DCFS workers who are supposed to be protecting children in the state. It could even mean that government unions make their contracts private. They could include a provision in their contract that says that it's sealed, that it's not open to the public, and that would override our Freedom of Information Act laws that require it to be public. So it's really hard to comprehend all of the different ways that this could affect the lives of people in Illinois by granting so much power constitutionally guaranteed to a third-party special interest in the government unions here in the state.
That's difficult to digest. Do you all have a link or article that covers the different provisions you've identified that could be overridden?
Yeah, and I can put that in the chat so that people can check that out.
Sure, and we can certainly make sure that gets around to our different social media channels here. But that is significant, and it's really hard to process. I mean, it seems like it's making the unions a branch of government that's almost more powerful than the legislature. They could pick and choose what laws apply to them. I can't think of another situation quite like that.
There isn't. We've actually been going through we went through all of the state constitutions. There's nothing in another state constitution like this. We're currently in the process of going through all 50 states, and for their state labor laws, digging into those labor laws to see if there are any others that allow collective bargaining agreements in any way to override state law. And there's nothing like Illinois law has.
Yeah, I mean, this is wild. It's sort of, you can't imagine how they could have written this to be give unions more power. I don't know what else exactly they would do. And maybe they could come up with something, just literally, we're going to become the government and we'll just ban the legislature and there'll be no governor and it'll just be us. I guess that would be more blatant and give them more power, but this is right up there. And then of course, and you mentioned prohibiting right to work, which almost seems like a throw-in at this point. I mean, with all the other provisions, it's like, yeah, I guess that if you're going to do the other three with all the implications there, you may as well throw in a ban on right to work just to be safe.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that, so this was passed by our General Assembly to go on the ballot in May of 2021. In 2019, there was an amendment that was considered by our General Assembly, and all it did was prohibit right to work. That was the only thing it did. So, 2 years later, you fast forward and you now have this amendment that has all of these extra provisions. So it's very purposeful that, this was not just supposed to be a right to work amendment. This was supposed to be something that expands government power. And I really think that government unions in Illinois are using private sector unions and their stance on right to work to get this passed. The relationship there between private sector unions and public sector unions has always baffled me a little bit. I understand it. They consider it like a brotherhood, But there are things that government unions do, particularly in Illinois, that are harmful for private sector workers, including those that are represented by private sector unions. And this is one of those things. The rights only apply, the rights that are provided in those first few provisions only apply to government workers, so about 7%. But the taxes that will increase apply to everyone. So private sector workers, those that are represented by unions, are going to get hit by the taxes that their unions are supporting. So that's why I say I feel like government unions are using that relationship in order to get this passed.
It's incredible, and you have the right to work thrown in here, and it contrasts well. We have Tennessee has a constitutional amendment on the ballot to add a right to work without being forced to join a union to their state constitution. And just quickly pulled up an article that says Illinois sends the 8th most people of any state to Tennessee. So it shows it's 20th the other direction. So the people are more attracted to the right to work state than the state that's doing this absolute monstrosity of pro-big labor policies and borrowing.
And that's interesting because Tennessee also has an Amendment 1 on the ballot this year. Their Amendment 1 is the exact, well, I shouldn't say the exact opposite, but it actually allows right to work in the state. Yeah. So you have these two very different Amendment 1s that are pending this election. One is going to strip away the rights of workers, because that's really what a ban on right to work does. It means that forever workers won't be allowed to choose for themselves whether or not to support their union. And then you have Tennessee that's granting them rights, granting them freedom. And I don't think you could have a more different set of Amendment 1s than we have this election season.
It's quite the dichotomy, and folks can read more from our ballot guide at atr.org/ballot guide. And we'll throw that link in the chat, and Mailee's article. And you were getting into costs. Actually, we had a question from the audience as to how much this will cost taxpayers. You'll have run some numbers. What have you found?
So if we've looked at property taxes, now these tax increases could come through anything. It could come through increased gas tax, income tax. Just since Pritzker has been in office, there's been 24 new taxes and fees in Illinois. But the most likely place for this to come is through property taxes, because that is where, the local government unit is negotiating with the local government union, and the cost goes up and they pass that on to taxpayers through property taxes. What we have found is that if property tax rates simply continue to increase at their long run average rate, the typical homeowner in Illinois will pay over $2,100 more in additional property taxes over the next 4 years. So that $2,100 is just the baseline. That is if we continue on the trajectory that we are on right now. But taxes will likely increase at an even higher rate because of all of the new demands that government unions can make, costly new demands. And we just don't know what could be demanded or how high taxes could rise because it's never been tested before.
Yeah, that's always what you like to hear. It's guaranteed to cost a boatload of money, and we don't have any idea of what the ceiling on costs will be.
And it's interesting, proponents, their comment, because I've been in a couple of debates with proponents, and their response is, well, we just don't know what will be in these contracts. And it's like, well, that's the problem. Like, you have created this open-ended constitutional right to put just about anything and everything in a government contract. That is going to cost money. It's also surprising that, proponents or certain people in the media question how taxes would rise. Well, government costs money. Like, it doesn't just run on its own for free. These government contracts already cost money. If you're adding new provisions to these government contracts, that will cost more money. So it has to come from somewhere. And like we've talked about, that's going to be the taxpayers.
Yeah, and as you hit on before, I'm sure to remind folks, is that the ability to negotiate on anything and make these contracts private, all these. So there's the cost aspect, and then a potential safety aspect to this. We've had a lot of parental choice and control and school fights across the country, and this would just to give a huge win to teachers unions in those situations, and parents
Good.
would know the background of the people in school with their kids, and they'd
Yeah,
have
and
no ability to know.
the article that I know was posted here that we identified 350 laws. Some of those laws relate to school curriculum. They could override that potentially through their collective bargaining agreements. Some of it has to do with immunizations. What immunizations are required for a student to go to school? That could, teachers unions could add immunizations that they want to see happen, or they'll walk out to get their demands met. So it really does place more power in the hands of teacher union leadership to make decisions for students than it does in the hands of parents.
Yeah, it just we don't have time to go through all the potential repercussions here, but it really
It's a
goes
lot.
to show how wide-ranging and far-reaching that this could get, and why people should care. We would care about your pocketbook for sure, but there are other very good reasons to be concerned about this. We had a question about what taxpayers can do to stop the ballot measure. I mean, there's one obvious answer, but other suggestions, Mailee?
Yeah, definitely spread the word. IllinoisPolicy.org, our Facebook, our Twitter feed, any of the social media has a plethora of information out there that can be shared. And so that's one place to go and spread the word to your friends and colleagues in Illinois, telling them about this amendment. Another way is obviously to donate. There is a ballot committee. There is a Vote No on Amendment 1 committee. The unions are outspending the committee. So the Vote Yes for Workers' Rights Committee had, the last time I looked, about $14 million. The Vote No committee had only $2 million. So, unions are outspending, and most of that money comes from unions. So unions are outspending the Vote No committee. So that's another place that you can look at if you want to get involved.
Okay, great. Well, we're winding up on questions. Yeah, definitely check out Mailee's work. Mailee, where can folks go to follow Illinois Policy Institute?
Our website is illinoispolicy.org. This is our main focus right now. So we have a number of articles that are up there. One in particular is a study guide on Amendment 1, where we outline not just the tax implications, but also like these other implications that we've talked about with regard to laws that can be overridden, what it will do to the business climate in Illinois. So there is all sorts of information there at illinoispolicy.org.
Definitely check that out, and stay tuned with us. We'll continue doing podcasts on ballot measures throughout the week. Talking about Arizona tomorrow at 1 o'clock, we'll be here, and 4 p.m. Friday, we will cover election-related measures, of which there are many. So big topics there. So appreciate you very much, Mailee, for joining us. It was a great conversation. Awful issue. We're having some fun making fun of the absurdity of it, but I mean, this is extremely dangerous stuff that will further cripple Illinois and cause problems for the entire country. So it's a very dangerous measure, and appreciate your insight and expertise on it.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. All right. We'll sign off. Thanks everyone for joining us.